today, founding fallacies. We were looking forward to this. As you know, we had to postpone it. Fortunately, we were able to reschedule again. And I think many of you have heard the story of my relationship with Kelly over the years. I first met her when she was a student at Edgewood Junior High School in a gifted and talented class. And you had this little girl there, and I remember I was talking about Tutankhamun and the discovery of his tomb, and all of a sudden I started getting these perceptive questions, and I thought to myself, is she a ringer or something? I mean, how did this happen? But that was Kelly. Years later, I presented her with our high school diploma, but then was terribly shocked. She went on to college, and she became a math major. And I said to myself, where did I go wrong? Where did Kelly's parents go wrong? The major in math when she had all this ability as far as history. But fortunately, it's kind of like the lost sheep returning to the fold, And so her interest in history has been renewed, and she has been a spectacular presenter here at the center. So without further ado, Dr. Kelly Jackson. Right.
Yeah, I am a math professor here at Camden County College, and that's my job. Jobs are work. And history's the hobby. History's the thing that when I have extra time that I'm spending my time doing. So when I go home from work, what I do is take care of my interest in history. So Hamilton has been kind of taken over the universe in terms of interest in pop culture. And as I listened to this CD, as I was lucky enough to see the show, what I realized is that a lot of people kind of take it as history, like it's a factual thing, almost documentary-like, and that's not really accurate. So I wanted to take a little time to go through not an exhaustive list, but some of the inaccuracies that are there, and use that to review some of the things that you may think you know about the American founding that might not quite be on target. So one of the first things that comes to mind is Paul Revere's ride. The tagline in Hamilton is about who tells your story, right? How is history going to see you? And when it comes to the myth, really, of Paul Revere's ride, it all comes to a poem that was written not in the time that things happened, but in 1860. So when you are reading Longfellow's poem, you would think that Paul Revere was the only person involved in the process of spreading the alarm. And what you really find is that there were other major riders within that night and within that time period, and that the idea of getting information back and forth around the towns was something that was not uncommon. So having riders riding between towns spreading messages was not an uncommon thing. The main point of the ride that night was not so much the British are coming in terms of the war. Everyone knew that. It was more about Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were in hiding, to get them a message to hide a little better, to be sure that they weren't captured, to be sure that the British didn't get them. And so several different riders went out just to be sure that we were going to be able to get that message to the Big Two to make sure that they were going to be safe. But it was well known that the British were coming and were in fact there. There were British already in those areas. The ride of Paul Revere kind of predates the beginning of the Hamilton musical. We open in the musical with kind of a catchy tune that talks about Hamilton as being a bastard and an orphan and a son of a whore and a Scotsman and so forth and so on. And he was this $10 founding father without a father. Almost all of that is pretty much wrong, misleading, exaggerated. So there's an interesting website that gives us primary documents from the founders. They all wrote and kept their correspondence. And so we have a lot of really great primary sources of them writing letters back and forth. And in some cases, some of them would keep copies of their own letters, what they sent, so they didn't have to depend on someone keeping them on the other end. So we do have great information from Hamilton himself in letters that he wrote on this topic. So this is actually a letter in 1785 that Hamilton is writing to his brother, and he's talking about that he wants to help him out, so he wants to contribute to his relief, and he's also inquiring about their dear father, and referring to him as dear here, and questioning because he hadn't heard from him if he was still alive. So he looks, in this, again, he's talking about his heart bleeds at the recollection of his misfortunes, speaking about his father, right? Should he be alive, inform him of my inquiries, beg him to write to me, tell him how ready I shall be to devote myself and all I have to his accommodation and happiness. Hamilton wanted his father to come live with him. He was unable to convince him to do so, but he did have correspondence with him. This is this was in 85. This is now 97. So it's now several months since I've heard from my father. So he had been in correspondence with him within that time. And he was concerned about him at that time. This is another example here. He's talking about he wanted to bring him to live with him. The father was afraid that the change in climate would be problematic for him. So, this is something that he had a relationship with his father. He was not an orphan, nor was he a founding father without a father. He had a father. So his father and mother split. His father was not in the household. His father went to other islands. But who among us does not have family members who have split, literally and figuratively, gone their other ways, have kept in correspondence through now it might be email or phone calls, but who don't see their children. It's not as uncommon as what this is led to be. This is a letter to William Jackson in 1800 where Hamilton is essentially giving a little bit of a biography of himself. And he talks about his father as being a younger son. He was a younger son of a Scottish lord, and what that meant was he wasn't going to inherit property. So James Hamilton, the father, went to the Caribbean islands, which is where a lot of people went to make some quick cash. Idea being, I'm not inheriting from my family, but if I go there down to the islands, make some money, I can go back to Scotland and buy what I need. He did not have the success in the islands that would allow him to go back to Scotland and do that. But he went there to, his father went there to the islands to take part in the sugar trade and to try to earn some money. He describes his personality here as being too generous, too easy a temper. So his father was a person who wasn't a bad guy. Hamilton had warm feelings toward him. He talked about the fact that he got help from his friends in Scotland. He also, several years before his death, by me. So Hamilton, again, is talking about the fact that he helped support his father prior to his death. It was his fault to have too much pride and too large a portion of indolence, but his character was otherwise without reproach, and his manners those of a gentleman. So, these are not words of a man who is looking at his father as someone who has abandoned him, who he doesn't have a relationship with at all. He, in evidence of this, has several entries in his account books where he's provided money to his father. So, here are 4 occasions, paying $300, $100, $225, and so forth. So, in this evidence, we definitely see that there's a relationship there. To say that he has no father is a fairly misleading statement to be making there. We also have the relationship between his father and mother, which, because he's called a bastard, they're saying that he's not married. And so the circumstances on that are that his mother, Rachel, had been married before and had a divorce that was not a particularly nice divorce. Who hasn't had that happen, right? But in the islands, when you had a not particularly nice divorce, one of the things that the husband could say in the divorce proceedings was that the wife was not allowed legally to remarry. And that was the case for Rachel. She was not permitted by law to remarry. So she did have a common law marriage, lived as married to James. And there's some question as to whether at some point they actually did have a marriage. There's no evidence of it, but Hamilton himself claimed that they at some point got married. So in this letter to William Jackson, he makes that claim. Now that could be something that he's doing to try to legitimize himself, or it could be accurate. But there are church records that list James Hamilton and Rachel Hamilton, his wife. So there are records that at least they were living as, cohabiting as husband and wife. He goes on to explain that his mother basically got involved with a Danish man by the last name Levine, who kind of showed like he had money, but then really didn't have all the money. He was kind of flashing the cash, but didn't really have anything to back that up. Marriage went bad, ended in separation. Mother moved to St. Kitts, acquainted with my father, and a marriage between them ensued. Unluckily, it turned out the divorce was not absolute, but qualified. That's where I was mentioning that she wasn't actually allowed to remarry. So the second marriage was not considered lawful. And when, in fact, she died, because Alexander and his brother James were not considered legitimate children, what little she had went to her son from the first marriage, who lived in the States in South Carolina. And so Hamilton actually was not given any inheritance from his mother when at a young age, when he was at a young age when she passed away. But common law marriage was not something that was unusual, right? Benjamin Franklin was in a common law marriage with his wife. In a kind of a similar situation, she was married, had a guy run out on her, coincidentally to the Caribbean islands, and there was some question as to whether he was even alive or dead, but they didn't have the money to prove one way or the other. So they entered into, in September of 1730, a common law marriage. There was never an official ceremony of any kind. They lived together as man and wife. And when you hear about Franklin's children, his first son, William, that was, by the way, born the year that these two got together, but from someone else, is referred to as his bastard son. But when you hear about the two children that he had with Deborah, they're never referred to as bastard children, even though there was never ever a ceremony between these two. So this idea of applying, right, one standard for Hamilton and another standard for Franklin is something that is a little bit questionable. So common law marriage is something that would happen when you weren't able to prove, for example, the death of a spouse, or they went off somewhere to war or to do something, and you weren't able to prove, they just were gone. And then if a marriage ensued after that, a lot of times for practical purposes, it wouldn't be a legal marriage. So common law marriages were common. Franklin actually lived in England for 15 of the last 17 years of his marriage. So one might conclude that he also kind of left his wife and left his children and went on to do other things. He was a little older at the time, but he was certainly not living in close quarters with his wife for much of the end of their time together. She died in 1774, so it was a few months before he came back during that period of time where he was back in the States briefly. So back to the play, we get through the kind of first song there where we're identifying him with all these words that aren't perfectly accurate in describing him. And we then get a peek at his desire to go to Princeton, right? College of New Jersey at the time. And the quote in the song, "I was seeking an accelerated course of study when I got sort of out of sorts with a buddy of yours. I may have punched him. It's a blur, sir," right? And he handles the financials, and that's the bursar, right? So it's a neat little turn of phrase there, but never happened, right? There was never any type of physical altercation. Hamilton did want to get into Princeton. He was denied that accelerated course. He was very interested in getting through quickly. One of the reasons that he was denied that accelerated course is that a guy who did get an accelerated course essentially had a nervous breakdown doing so, Mr. James Madison, had just kind of gotten through there, and there was a little bit of a bad taste in their mouth over this idea of the accelerated course. So he moved on to greener pastures, to what we now think of as Columbia, at the time King's College, in order to study. But there wasn't a physical altercation. Burr did go to Princeton, so Burr was a graduate of Princeton, and his father, Aaron Burr, was a president at Princeton. So when you go to Princeton and you see the buildings that say Aaron Burr, it's not Aaron Burr, the duelist, it's Aaron Burr, father of the duelist. All right? We then start to introduce other characters into the play, and with the story of tonight, we see kind of the three major secondary actors. And for the first act, this actor is playing Lawrence, friend to Hamilton. We've got Lafayette, and we've got Hercules Mulligan. Right? In the second act, these same actors appear, but they're playing different characters. So in the second act, we've got the young Philip Hamilton, son of Alexander. We have Jefferson, and we have Madison. So the same three actors are playing two different roles in the story. So these gentlemen, as they come together and they start lifting their glasses and clinking, and the implication that they're all there kind of in New York, Sons of Liberty, and that they're ready to spread the revolution. Problem is that Lafayette didn't even get to the States until the summer of '77. So this is at least a year or two after when these activities would have been going on. And Hercules Mulligan was 32 years old at the time. Hamilton's 18. So they were not contemporaries. Mulligan was a member of the New York Sons of Liberty, and he was a mentor to Hamilton, but he would not have been a drinking buddy contemporary to Hamilton. And Lawrence also, he was overseas at the time and didn't return to the States until fall of '77. So again, he's at least a year or two beyond when this time period is supposed to be happening. So we introduce the characters, and then the Schuyler sisters come on the screen, right, on the scene. So they're there, and if you know the song here, they're singing a whole lot about New York and how it's the greatest city in the world, and all this stuff about New York. They also have some lines about the Declaration of Independence, and Angelica in particular is singing along, and she talks about how she's been reading Thomas Paine and about Jefferson and his Declaration, and she wants to make sure that we're going to include women in the sequel. So these are things that Angelica is saying. Now, there's no real evidence that Angelica herself was a women's activist, right, or that she was particularly avid in the revolutionary works. There were women that did that. And Abigail Adams happens to be one of them. And this is from a letter, again, primary source here. I long to hear that you have declared independency. So this is in March. So she's talking about declaring independence at that point. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, so she's already looking at, we'll have to have some type of constitution or something along those lines. I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to form a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So she's given it right on back with the language of the Declaration, with the language of taxation without representation. Right? The words that are in here are things that she's throwing to her husband, but these are Abigail's words. So, in the play, we're taking something from a character, a real Walk the Earth character and putting them in the word, in the word phrases of another person. Some of the women that we think of when we think American Revolution and woman, right? First one that comes to mind probably is Betsy Ross. So here's another kind of myth. Where did it come from? Well, 100 years after there was, they were getting ready to kind of celebrate the centennial 100 years later, and grandchild passes along the family lore that Betsy Ross had a visit from George Washington, and that she was asked to create the flag and all this. There's not really much evidence of that. And one of the things that is kind of interesting, just kind of look at this, if you look at this site, so this is historical flags. When you look in that time period, right, so June 1776, you look at that time period, the number of different flags that are out and about, lots and lots of different flags, because each state was its own separate little colony. Each state had its own flag. There was not this united flag. When you looked at the old Union, it would take the British flag, all right, and it would put it within some other design. And on the battlefield, that became difficult for people to then recognize, oh, is this an enemy or is this a friend? And so they wanted to have something that looked a little different than that, which is where they came up with the idea of the blue background with the stars. But it was never specified in what pattern those stars need to be. So you'll see flags that have those stars in a variety of different patterns. We have that nice circular one. Washington had one that was just the blue with the stars on it, Hopkins flag, and so forth. And you'll also notice that a lot of these are six-pointed stars. This is even after the famous Betsy Ross so-called flag. One of the things that is attributed to Betsy Ross as possibly a contribution is that she showed how by folding a piece of material in the right way, with one single snip of the scissors, you can create a perfect five-pointed star. And so from a sewing standpoint, it's easier to sew a five-pointed star than it is stars of other shapes. And so that may be a contribution that she had in terms of creative contribution. What we know she was is a seamstress who sewed flags. That's not in dispute. But that she created the flag that was in use, or that that flag was the only flag in use, is a bit of an exaggeration. Another woman that we hear of is Molly Pitcher. So Molly Pitcher, the legend there is that she was a camp follower, that she was there where her husband was, and she was bringing some water to he and some of his friends there. And in the middle of things, because this was at the Battle of Monmouth, had got heat exhausted. He kind of fell over, and she picked up the ramrod and started to fill the cannon and to help with the fight. So this is, again, a legend that has some truth to it, some exaggeration to it. The person who is sometimes referred to as the Molly Pitcher character, it was a live Walk the Earth person who was from Carlisle, who ended up in Carlisle. There's a statue to her in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Molly Pitcher. But she was kind of an amalgam of the women who would follow the troops. There were oftentimes, in current times you talk about military brats, right? That's what these were. These are families that follow the man of the house. They would be in camp or nearby. They would help with sometimes washing. They would help with nursing. They would help with tending livestock and so forth and so on. They didn't so much cook. Cooking was a man's job in the army, but they were paid for their duties, and they were asked to follow certain rules of behavior when they were there. So, the camp follower was someone that was a big part of the success of the camp, and they helped to take care of jobs to make things go smoothly within camp. Molly Pitcher does have a service area named after her on the turnpike, right? So, we do remember her, or those like her. Sybil Ludington is one of the women who made the ride, not the day that Paul Revere did, but a couple days later. So she rode actually twice the distance that Revere rode to let the folks in Danbury, Connecticut know. Pardon? Yeah, there you go. A side saddle too, she says. So so there were women that were taking part in the war effort at that time. Also within this song, we refer to the Declaration of Independence, which again is predating a little bit the Hamilton involvement. He's arriving here and starting at King's College and starting to get involved politically right at about the time of Paul Revere's ride. Like, he's becoming aware of what's going on in Boston. He's starting to write about and think about these revolutionary ideas. But he was certainly not around in the Continental Congress where the Declaration is being made. So I want to talk a little bit about the Declaration. I mean, we here think of it as July 4th, right? We celebrate what? Right? 4th of July is the Declaration of Independence. So what's interesting is we did not actually declare independence at that time on July 4th. So that's a little bit of a mismemorized fact on its own. What happened on that day is that Dunlop actually put out some broadsides that printed what the Declaration said. So there was some agreed upon language at that point that then began to get promulgated out to the public. We also hear that the Liberty Bell was rung so hard that it had a crack in it, right? And that happened on July 4th. That didn't happen either because the bells of the city didn't ring on July 4th. On July 8th, there was some ringing of the bells, but the July 4th, it's very unlikely that any bells at all were rung, let alone this bell. And because the steeple in what we now call Independence Hall was so bad at the time, it's unlikely that the bell was even ringing in that contemporary period of time. So the bell itself has the language on it: proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Does anyone know why the bell was cast in the first place? For what reason they made the bell? So it was actually on the 50th anniversary for William Penn, having written some of the laws that set up the state of Pennsylvania. And the Bible passage here, Leviticus, if you look at the line before, it makes reference to 50th year. So this is actually a phrase that was associated with the 50th year and this anniversary of sorts. But at the time, it was not considered the Liberty Bell. It was not a symbol of anything in particular. It was a bell that happened to be in the city, and so rang because of that. So some of the stories, again, that you get, the childhood stories of the guy who was standing in the steeple waiting for his grandson to come, let him know that the declaration had been made so he could ring the bell, that's just not something that happened. The bell actually got its name later in about 1830s or so as an abolitionist, right? In the abolitionist movement, they were essentially saying, we are not keeping that promise that's on that bell. And so the bell became a symbol more for abolitionists and more in Civil War times than it ever was in Revolutionary times. So the timeline of the way things happened when it comes to the Declaration, June 11th, we get a committee appointed, that committee of 5. So this is going to be Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Roger Sherman, and can't even remember his last name because we never know who they are, right? Jefferson did it all. So the committee is appointed, and they're going to put together the Declaration. It was a very common practice at the time for the large Congress to create subcommittees to do work. So this is the committee. From June 12th to the 27th, primarily Jefferson, but the committee of 5 are writing and revising, coming up with something they can give to Congress. The 28th, they actually read their draft to Congress, and debate begins a couple days later. On the 2nd, we actually have the formal declaration being made. And at the 4th, really what happens is we get the thing printed. So we get the adoption of the words and the printing happens. By the 6th, we're now printing out into the newspaper. It wasn't until the 19th that they decided, hey, maybe we should get people to sign this thing. And so you started it at August 2nd, and continuing all the way through till the following January, have people signing the document. So the artwork that you see with all the people in the room huddled around a document that they're all going to sign at the same time, that never happened. So how did Jefferson become the one who was the primary author? At first, Ben Franklin was the one that they thought would be the primary author, but he basically said, no, thank you. I don't want to write anything that a group of people is going to revise. Adams then became kind of the second person, and he said, no, but his reason was a little different. He felt like this was something that needed to come from someone that wasn't from Massachusetts, because he did not want it to look like a regional Massachusetts issue. He wanted it to look like something that was spread throughout the entire colonies. So having someone like Franklin from Pennsylvania would show it to be a more widespread idea, and that by having it from Virginia would be even better. And so this is a quote from Adams. First reason, you're a Virginian, and we should have a Virginian at the head of this. Second reason, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You're very much otherwise, and you can write 10 times better than I can. So these are Adams' words about why Jefferson was going to be the primary author. Now, by author, I want you to understand that doesn't mean that the ideas are Jefferson's. The way that it's written, the authorship is Jefferson's, but the ideas are not particularly new ideas. Jefferson does come back to Franklin. Franklin is the one who took, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. That's Jefferson's words. And he brings in, we hold these truths to be self-evident. The idea being that sacred puts a religious spin on them. And this self-evident was more the philosophical ideas of the time, rationality rather than religion. And so that was a change that Franklin made. 47 alterations were made within that committee of 5. So Jefferson himself, as he's massaging it, and Adams and Franklin are the primary ones that made little adjustments. And you can see on the original documents, which are actually available, different cross-outs and spots where changes are made. The document, as I said, was signed throughout 6 months' time before it got done. But the ideas within, if you go all the way back to 1765, when you first pull together a Congress of the colonies, the Stamp Act Congress, they start to declare things. So they have a declaration of rights and grievances. This is where they're going to start to, through 14 statements, let Parliament know, hey, these are things we think are problematic. We are Englishmen. We are citizens of, right, and represented by, theoretically, right, the king and the Parliament. And so they have things that they feel are being done to them that are different from mainland Englanders. And so they start to list out, hey, you're treating us differently this way, this way, this way. In the Declarations of Rights and Resolves, as a response to the Intolerable Act, again, detailed list of grievances, right? In the Olive Branch Partition, they're letting the king know, here's what we need you to do in order to avoid conflict. Then we have another declaration of causes and necessities for taking up arms. So it's letting them know what they think are unconstitutional, what's objectionable, the taxes, the use of courts, and so forth. George Mason in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, this is all prior to Jefferson's Declaration. Listen to these words. That all men are by nature equally free and independent, have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, and with means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So Jefferson said it more eloquently, but George Mason's who said it. Right? So there are things that, like if Thomas Jefferson turned in the Declaration of Independence on Turnitin, which is our current plagiarism program that we put students' papers through, he would have a little trouble with some of the stuff that was in there, in that it's not like he's citing sources, but a lot of it is not necessarily original in thought. So the ideas are not original. When we talk about authorship, he's a great wordsmith, like Adam said, he writes 10 times better. So a far less complicated way of saying this same thing is what appears in the Declaration, but it was in the Virginia Declaration of Rights first. So when we think about those words and all men created equal and things along those lines, we oftentimes shift right to the word slave and think, well, not so much. Or Native Americans, we think, not so much. But here's a quote. So this says, few of their children in the country learn English. The signs in our streets have inscriptions in both languages. Unless the stream of their importation could be turned, they will soon so outnumber us that we will not preserve our language, and even our government will become precarious. This sounds like something that could be written like a week ago, right? But this was written by Ben Franklin in 1753 with respect to Germans, right? He was very concerned that the English would be losing their pull. These were English colonies, right? The idea of the melting pot, the idea that people from all countries come in, these were English colonies, and they were protective of that English heritage. You can see a lot of times in that language, the very, very first slide I think I had up about he was a Scotsman, right? At the time, right, being a Scotsman was something that was not equal to being a mainland England, right, resident. That it was going to be something that was problematic. And so that was something you need to wrap your head around here, is when we start talking about all men are created equal, the people we subtract out is a lot of people that are subtracted out. We can take out all the women, we can take out all the Native Americans, we can take out anyone of Asian descent, we can take, right? You can start subtracting and really see that there's the word all is a little bit problematic. So Franklin did write on population. He, some of what he did was talking about the growth rates and how eventually the area that became the United States would have more people in it than mainland England itself, and how is that small country going to rule the larger one. But he really wants to protect policies that are going to protect English settlers. And so you want to understand that the idea that Hamilton was from a Caribbean island, or that his heritage was Scots on one side and French, right, on his mother's side, was something that was problematic. The reason that he was such a successful aide to Washington was because he spoke fluent French, right? And so when we're trying to work with the French and we're writing letters with the French, having Hamilton be able to translate there is something that's really an advantage to him. And so he becomes the right-hand man, right? We get the description in the play of how Hamilton is the right-hand man. So he was actually an aide-de-camp. He was someone who took care of the letters, so he would receive and correspond for Washington, and because he did a good job at it, sometimes he would have the ability to just answer on behalf of. So sometimes things didn't even get to Washington. Hamilton would take care of certain things at his level on his own there. But the relationship is a little overplayed in the way that it's set up here. Washington was given Hamilton's name as a suggestion. Hamilton was not really interested in being a secretary. He felt that because of his upbringing, he was never going to be a person who was going to gain fame or riches or respect unless he did so in a position in war. One of his famous quotes or letters from when he was just a teen, about 14 years old, "I wish there was a war," because he felt like that was going to be his way out of where he was. So within the wartime, we have a ball, Winter's Ball, and this is where we have Hamilton finally meet up with Angelica and her sister, who becomes his wife, Elizabeth. And so there's a lot going on in here, again, to kind of straighten out. All right. First of all, when we talk about winter, if I ask you about what's the horrible winter associated with the American Revolution, you're going to tell me the winter at Valley Forge. Winter at Valley Forge was not a bad winter at all. We see all of these pictures and this artwork with all this snow. Yeah, it didn't happen. Truth about winter at Valley Forge. The low temperature in the Philadelphia area, which was measured on a daily basis, had a average low of 33 degrees. So that's not unlike what might be happening now. We're in the same general area. If you look at the low temperatures in that particular year, in December there were 17 days that got below freezing at all. Typically, we get 21 days within the month that we get below freezing at all. In January, there were 15. Typically, we 25. In February, 13. Typically, we have 22. And 5 versus 14. So this was, relative to normal weather in this area, a milder winter. It only frosted 50% of the mornings. There was only one hard freeze in a 3-day period from December 29th to the 31st. There were only 2 days that got into single digits the entire winter. There were no snows that would have been considered blizzard level. And the largest snow that there was, which amounted to about an 8-inch snow, like a lot of times what happens here is, a day or two later it rains and it gets washed away. So, what you want to think about the weather is, okay, so let's say even if it was in the 40s, if you're bare feet and without a coat, that's still going to feel pretty cold, right? So it's miserable. It's miserable. But the artwork of the snow and everything you see with Valley Forge has the snow. That's an exaggeration. That's not really the way that it happened. This is a quote from Martha Washington. "Officers and men are chiefly in huts, which they say is tolerable, comfortable." So we've all seen, the little huts that they have, the recreation at Valley Forge and so forth. But the reality is, most of the primary sources, when you read them, they don't talk about temperature as much as hunger. Right? Hunger was an issue. So what happens is, there's not a battle going on here. This is winter camp. So they've just lost Philadelphia. They're retreating. They're miserable because they've had, at Brandywine, an awful defeat. They've had to give up the city of Philadelphia. They're pulling off, to settle in for the winter. They want to be close enough to Philadelphia that they can get there if they need to, but far enough away that if the British are going to come at them, they're going to have plenty of notice to know that that's happening. So, they pull off and they're going to be there. Well, they need food. So they, as Washington calls it, forage. But what really happens is they pillage the people of the towns, who then don't have a very great view of the Continental Army, right? These are people who are a national army, not the local militias. So the local militias are your next door neighbor volunteering to help out. I'm going to feed them, right? We still have these local militias. But the Continental Army, they're something that people are suspicious of. They don't believe in a standing army. That's part of what they want to jettison, in terms of the British having standing armies. So this idea of just having an army hanging out there in Valley Forge, not something that's particularly positive. Having them come and pillage from your stores, even less so. So this is problematic. They don't exactly have people bending over backwards to give them goods. The real problem here, to be honest, is the mildness of the winter. There's a lot of rain. There's a lot of swollen rivers. It's very difficult to move things from one place to another because of mud, right? So it's just not easy to get around. As they have these thaws and so forth, supplies start to be able to come. What you find is that of the 2,000 people who died, 2/3 of them were in the months of March, April, and May, when it's not about cold, right? These are soldiers who were dying of dysentery and flu and typhoid, right? These are things that are killing more people than the cold did, or strictly speaking, starvation did. For 3 years, winter camp was in Morristown. Morristown is where the winter ball took place. So when we have Elizabeth meeting Hamilton, it's not in the greatest city in the world, which they have you believing in the way that the show is set. It's in Morristown, New Jersey, right? And she's visiting an aunt and is going to meet Hamilton there. So when the British were in camp there in 79-80, the high temperature, got above freezing only once in the entire month of January. Between January 19th and 31st, it was sub-zero 9 days, sub-zero. 21 days in the teens. They had a low of -16 reported in New York. There's never been a temperature that low since. -15 is the lowest. Low of -22 in Hartford, Connecticut. You had the Hudson and East Rivers, the New York Harbor, Long Island Sound, freezing. You had the Chesapeake Bay, York and James Rivers, freezing. All the way down to North Carolina, right? The Sound freezes over. So this was a cold winter. Snow fell in December and remained for 3 months. Never was snow off. It was never off the ground for 3 months' time. There was wind that toppled houses down. Several feet of snow. This is a quote from Joseph Plum Martin. At one time, that should say, it snowed the greater part of 4 days straight, and there fell nearly as many feet of snow. We're talking 4 feet of snow. Problem here is going to be starvation, and there's less ability to forage because moving from one place to another is problematic. There's no grass. There's nothing to find. But Morristown isn't as good as a story, because in Morristown, there were always rebellions and complaining and whining, and they weren't these steadfast soldiers who took it like a man and who overcame the odds, and it was the low point of the war, and things all turned around after that. In fact, things turned around before that, because Saratoga happened before Valley Forge happened. And Saratoga was really the turning point of the war. That's when the French decided, okay, they're good enough that we can give them a little money and a little support. And when the French come in, that's when we can actually start to win. But Morristown is going to be a time period where there is real cold. The Weather Service actually points to it as the coldest winter in 400 years. Now, I'm not sure how they measured temperature for 400 years, but that's what the Weather Service says. Within the musical, we have this introduction at the ball, and then we have several songs that are talking about particularly Angelica, and the fact that she was such a kind-hearted soul that she gave Hamilton over to her sister. And one of the key phrases within the song, my father has no sons, so I'm the one who has to social climb for one, meaning that Hamilton is not quite high enough on the social ladder. She's got to marry better than him. Well, he had 4 sons. So she had 4 brothers. There was no real need there for her to social climb. She had 4 brothers at the time. In addition, she had eloped with John Church in 1777, right? This is taking place in 1779 and 1780. So we're talking about, right, 1777, she's married. By 1780, she already had 2 children, Philip and Kitty. And in 1783, she left for Europe and didn't come back again till 1797. So her participation in a lot of this play is just not something that happened. A lot of what you hear about this relationship with Angelica and Hamilton, and this speculation about an affair of the heart, is based on letters and things along those lines. So we have this letter. You should not have taken advantage of my sensibility and steal into my affections without my consent. But as you have done it, and as we are generally indulgent to those we love, I shall not scruple to pardon the fraud you have committed, on condition that for my sake, if not for your own, you will always continue to merit the partiality which you have so artfully instilled into me. That's pretty loving words, right? Cold in my professions, warm in my friendships, I wish, my dear, it might be in my power by action rather than words to convince you that I love you. I shall only tell you that till you bade us adieu, I hardly knew the value you had taught my heart to set upon you. Unfortunately, that's a letter to his friend John Lawrence. Hamilton was a flowery writer. When he wrote to Lafayette, he wrote like that. When he wrote to anyone, he used those kinds of terms of endearment to them. The 2 previous letters that I read to you were letters that he wrote to his friend Lawrence. Now, there is some speculation that maybe there was a little boy crush going on there. There's no evidence at all there was any type of relationship going on there. But at the time of Lawrence's death, which was at the tail end of the Revolution, when he died, most people will tell you Hamilton was a little more closed off to people after that and didn't let people get as close. He didn't have as deep of friendships after that friendship, after he passed. So this is another example here, right? I've written you 5 or 6 letters since you left Philadelphia, and I should have written you more had you made proper return. But like a jealous lover, when I thought you slighted my caresses, my affection was alarmed and my vanity piqued. I mean, this is something that is pretty flowery, but this is how he wrote to his friend. We all love you sincerely, but I have more of the infirmities of human nature than the others, and suspect myself of being bypassed by my partiality for you. I have a part for the public and a part for you. So these are all things that are indications that Hamilton writes in that style. Here's letters to Lafayette, right? As to myself, I am in truth yours for life. He talks about someone who I also love, right? He's talking about Lawrence, you know how much I loved him. So he throws around the word love, right? That's not something that's problematic to him. As we proceed through the war, we get a peek at Washington, and there's this kind of confrontational song where Washington says, you have to meet me inside. So 2 big things go on within that. One is a duel between Lawrence and General Lee. And in that, Burr, character on the stage, is the second to Lee. That didn't happen. So Edwards was actually not. There's actually, again, and these are Founders Online, so these are actual papers that have it. This is the account of the duel. So this was something that was in writing by Hamilton, who was the second to John Lawrence, and by Edwards. So General Lee, who has a second of Major Edwards, and Lawrence, who has a second of Hamilton, conduct this duel. So this is on Christmas Eve of 1778, just outside Philadelphia. That's where that happens. At the time, Burr was in upstate New York, right, doing some revolutionary activities. So he was in charge of some things in Westchester County, right, at that time. So he's nowhere near Philadelphia. He's nowhere near this duel. But he did write on behalf of Lee. Lee, if the whole reason that this duel is happening is because when they were in Monmouth, Lee kind of shows a little bit of cowardice, and he ends up being court-martialed for it. Washington, this is where they snag the tie from a loss, and it becomes again another kind of rallying point. But they were losing because Lee kind of mismanaged, and there was a court-martial. Well, Burr wrote on behalf of Lee in the court-martial because he fought at Monmouth, and he had heat stroke, and he fought valiantly, and so he basically was of the opinion, we were trying. He didn't do anything that was mismanagement. We were hot. Not only was Morristown the coldest, but Monmouth that time was the hottest. I mean, it was very bad in terms of heat. So this quarrel with Washington that happens like 5 seconds after the duel, right? The duel is going on. Washington walks in and hears about the duel and says, "Meet me inside." Well, in reality, "Meet me inside" is not in 1778. It's in 1781. So it's 3 years later that he has to meet him inside. So we've got a little time compression going on here as we race through the war. So in 1781, in New Windsor, New York, not anywhere near Philadelphia, we have the confrontation. And what happens is Washington essentially meets Hamilton at the bottom of a staircase and says, he needs to speak to him. And Hamilton says, "Okay, be right up." And Hamilton makes him wait for 10 minutes before he gets up there. He has a little conversation with Lafayette, takes a little bit more time than he should have. When he eventually gets up there, Washington basically says to him, "You made me wait here for 10 minutes. And Hamilton says, "Oh, I quit." And he resigns. So it was Hamilton who decided he wanted to leave, not Washington sending him away. Washington, in fact, apologized to Hamilton and tried to get Hamilton to stay, and Hamilton stubbornly refused to accept the apology. However, he waited until April, right, 2 months later, before he actually left. So he didn't stomp out. It wasn't, "Hey, go, okay, I'm gone." And the implication in the show is he sends him home to be with his pregnant wife. She needs you, right? You're going to have this baby. Well, Philip Hamilton wasn't born until January of 82. So that's a whole year beyond when he leaves and resigns. So the timeline issues that go on in this one scene, right? All of these things are compressed into looking like we have a duel. Washington's mad. He sends him home to be with his wife and son. That's not a month-long thing. That's 4 years worth of time going on there when all of this happens. War ends. We start to get into that period of time between when the revolution happens and we have a constitution. Burr is asked by Hamilton to help with the Federalist documents. That never happened. There's no evidence whatsoever that Hamilton asked Burr to do that. Angelica, in the same song, is talking about how she found a wealthy husband, right? And she's going to go over to England. The problem is that she left for England in 1783, and we're writing the Federalist between 1787 and 1789, right? So this is, again, time-wise, not something that could have happened this way. Within the song, we also have Washington, who's going to be elected president, saying to Hamilton, "Come on, be my right-hand man," right? And we have Hamilton kind of saying, "Hey, right hand doing what? State or Treasury? I can do them both." Well, introducing Washington's pick for Secretary of Treasury, Robert Morris. Washington wanted Robert Morris to be his Secretary of the Treasury because Morris, who had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a signer of the Articles of Confederation and a signer of the Constitution, was also the superintendent of finance through the period of time in the early 80s. He had ideas about a national bank, so he knew that Washington knew that he had the chops to think about a nation as opposed to colonies. He had controlled the Continental Navy, totally without pay. He didn't take money for this particular job. He oversaw the creation of U.S. coins for the first time. He created the decimal version of currency, where we do things based on tens rather than on 12s and pounds and things a lot, right? So he was the one who had that idea, and he helped Jefferson and Hamilton both see the advantages of that. He was a senator. He essentially financed out of his pocket large amounts of food and such for soldiers during the course of the war. And so he was the choice. Robert Morris was not so interested in that job. He had his own financial difficulties, but he's the one who put up Hamilton's name. And Washington's reaction was, what? Hamilton? You mean the secretary, the aide-de-camp Hamilton? He had no idea that Hamilton had chops as a financial wizard. So that was not something where Washington sought out Hamilton. Washington trusted the opinion of Robert Morris and asked Hamilton to come on. Hamilton would not have likely been Secretary of State because you want to have been abroad for something like that. And although he was someone who was an immigrant, it was from those sugar islands, he had not been over to Europe. So he had no connections in Europe. To be Secretary of State and to be negotiating was something that was likely not going to be something that he was going to be, have those connections to do. And he was abrasive. I mean, Washington did know him from working with him as an aide, that he was not always the most popular guy, right? So, this is the guy I want to send into the negotiating table. I'm not sure about that. So the idea that he would be Secretary of State was not likely. But Washington's pick for Secretary of State was John Jay. And he had been in the First and Second Continental Congress. He had been a minister to Spain. He was part of the negotiating team for the Treaty of Paris, ending the war. He was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs through the Articles of Confederation period. He wrote the article in the Federalist. He wrote the essays that pertain to foreign affairs. He also acted as the first Secretary of State before Jefferson came back from France. He was also the person that put together the Jay Treaty, which was a controversial treaty with England in later times. But he had far more experience there as the representative of the U.S. As a Secretary of State. But Jefferson was kind of second on the list. He also, again, in thinking about a national look, he was someone that fit the idea of having people from different states participate. So when you talk about a Secretary of State, you didn't want to have everyone be from Virginia, you didn't want everyone to be from New York, so we wanted to have people from different places around the newly United States. So Jefferson does come in, and we start to get these cabinet battles. Now, if you only watched the play and you watched these cabinet battles, you would be of the mind that Hamilton always wins the cabinet battles. Like, it seems like Washington favors and only listens to Hamilton. In reality, it's almost a 50-50 split. If you look at how many times Washington took the advice of Hamilton versus the advice of Jefferson, overall policy, he actually did listen to Jefferson quite often. One of the things that was the very first issues that came up in the U.S. after the Constitution was ratified was the idea of how the House is going to be apportioned. In the Constitution, it basically says, apportion the House by proportion of population. But it doesn't say how big the House should be, and it doesn't say how exactly mathematically should figure out this fair way, proportion way to do it, because you have to assign whole numbers of seats, and the way the population would divide out doesn't quite work. So Hamilton came up with a method for dealing with apportionment. And he put it through to Congress. Congress approved it, and it got to Washington's desk. And Washington did one of two vetoes as an entire 8-year presidency to veto Hamilton's apportionment, which is math's supposed to be his thing, right? Numbers are supposed to be his thing. And he instead implemented Jefferson's method of apportioning the House. So the mathematics of the two are beyond the scope of what I want to talk about today. But if you come to the Hamilton-Jefferson series that's coming up in the late fall, we'll be talking in detail about that. The public service announcement. So anyway, so Washington vetoes the Hamilton proposal there. And then we get into the Take a Break. This is the one where Philip Schuyler is introduced, the son. He's playing the piano and he's singing, and he talks about how he has a sister, but I want a little brother. Read that whole song? Well, he had several little brothers already. So by the time we're talking about he's 9 years old, he has his brother Alexander and his brother James had both been born at that point, and mom was actually pregnant with John at the time. So yeah, that again is a little bit of a stretch. Also within this song, we get the letter from Angelica where she's talking about the fact that in a letter I received from you, I noticed a comma in the middle of a phrase and it changed the meaning. Did you intend this? My dearest Angelica, with a comma after dearest. So you've written my dearest, comma, Angelica. That's the song. That didn't happen. However, Angelica wrote a letter to Hamilton with a misplaced comma. And Hamilton basically says, women, you don't know how to punctuate, do you? Right? He says, the most critical comma in your last letter, right? And he's kind of wanting to know, was it intentional or not? And he's saying to her, well, I guess I'll know based on whether you make this mistake again in the future, right? Or whether this is this random thing. So what happens is you actually see in her letter, because letters get saved, indeed, my dear, comma, sir. So she's actually the one who misplaced the comma in the letter. But she talks about here, she's in England at the time, and about her husband who is becoming a member of the British House of Commons. So she is in England and he's becoming a part of Parliament over there. And so again, we get some little bit of stretch of the relationship and the obsession that Hamilton was supposedly going to have with Angelica. So is it flirtatious? Yes. Right? Is he teasing with her? Absolutely. Right? But this is not as flowery as what he wrote to Lawrence. Where when you look at what he wrote to her, most of the time he'll refer to her as sister. She refers to him as brother in their correspondence. Where we do see Hamilton get involved with someone is in the Reynolds affair. And so we set up in 1792. This is when the affair happened. It actually is over a full year period of time. And I put the date here because I'm going to come back to this date as we move through. Because although the affair happens here, the main songs about it happen later in the play. Then we get into a little bit more of the running the government, the room where it happens. The big part of this is talking about the move of the capital to the Washington area, right, that Potomac area, in exchange for a vote yes on the bank. The implication was that Jefferson maneuvered to make this happen, and there's questions about whether it was already kind of a done deal before that, but there was absolutely a meeting where Hamilton and Madison get in the same room, offered by Jefferson to kind of broker a deal. Now, Madison and Hamilton were already folks who had worked together on the Federalist. They had common ground on certain issues, but as they started to implement the Constitution, Hamilton favored a stronger executive, and Madison favored a stronger Congress. And so when those two would kind of push up against one another, those two would be at odds in terms of how to interpret the Constitution. We then get to the Burr defeating Philip Schuyler, the father-in-law of Hamilton. This is supposed to be the beginning of the march to a duel. And so this is in 1791. Remember, duel doesn't happen until 1804. So this is quite a bit before this. Another cabinet battle, this one on neutrality between the U.S. and France. And this sets up the big, you're lucky you have Washington on your side. So again, we keep getting this push at us that Washington is favoring Hamilton, and that if you didn't have Washington, you wouldn't be able to do anything. So Washington comes out and he says, you know what? Thomas Jefferson resigned this morning. In reality, Jefferson resigned in 1793. So Washington, his term doesn't end until 1796. That's when he's deciding to not run for a third term, right? So the idea that he resigned in 93 with the intent of running for president, that just wasn't so. Jefferson, like Washington, kind of had this Brett Favre-ish retire multiple times and come back thing going. So each of them kept talking about, I'm going to retire to my farm and just live a simple life, and they kept getting pulled back in. Well, Jefferson resigned with the intent of hanging out at Monticello. Was not his intent at that moment. I'm leaving here so I can run for president. So spring of Washington's first term, right? Spring before his first term ends, Jefferson wants to resign. Washington basically begs him not to go. So, Jefferson was not brushing up against Washington. This idea that everything Hamilton wants, Hamilton gets, and everything I want, I don't get. Washington looked at Jefferson as a very important advisor. In October, he meets with Washington again. He did, Jefferson, think that Washington was starting to get a little bit old, and that he was influenced by his advisors maybe a little bit more than he needed to be. There were times when James Madison would have Washington write a bill, take it to Congress where he's the Speaker of the House, get the bill passed, and then bring it back to Washington for a signature, all on Madison's own writing, right? So, he was a ghostwriter for Washington. He was actually the one who wrote the first farewell address, Madison, and Hamilton edited that for the second farewell address. So Madison and Hamilton both were advising Washington. Washington was a person who would oftentimes have someone ghostwrite for him. He didn't have the education that some of these other guys had, but he would read, revise, and they would be his word. He would adopt them as his words. So he would stand behind those words. But Jefferson did announce his intent to resign in March of 93, at the time when Washington's term ended. So he was going to, when Washington's first term is up, I'm out. And Washington convinced him to stay on. So he did stay on through the year, and he made that promise based on, there was a Citizen Genet. It was beyond the scope of what we can handle here, but basically, a French man comes to the U.S. He does us dirty a little bit in terms of our neutrality agreement with respect to France. And Jefferson, because he's sympathetic to France, has that dirt kind of wash up on him a little bit. And although he and Hamilton both want, in terms of Genet, told him, look, you can't do this. It was problematic for Jefferson, and he did decide to step back out in 93. So. Continuing on, Adams now comes in because Washington's not going to run for that third term. And in the Adams administration song, one of the first things it talks about is Adams fired Hamilton. But that didn't happen because Hamilton had also resigned his post in Washington's second administration. He had resigned in 1795. And that was even before the farewell address. So he had resigned before Washington had even said, I'm not running for a third term. He went back to New York to try to earn a little money as a lawyer. So Adams was elected in 96 and inaugurated in 97. Hamilton had resigned 2 years before that. So he was not fired by Adams. And in fact, he was hired by Adams later to essentially run the army when we had the quasi-war with France. Washington was the nominal head, but Washington said, I'm only coming on if you bring Hamilton with me. And Hamilton was the one who actually did all the heavy lifting in that time period. Adams also had his son work with Hamilton in the law field as an intern. So he worked with Hamilton there. So now we get the we know. That's when the people come to Hamilton and say, that affair you had, we know about that affair you had. And the Reynolds pamphlet song as well. So within those couple songs, let's get a timeline going. So in the actual affair is in the summer of 91 to the summer of 92. In the summer of 91, he starts the affair. He tells his wife, you know what, being in a city, all this disease, why don't you go up home to Albany and hang out there? And then he kicks the can down the road about going up to see her in Albany for the better part of that year. Now, they did, a couple of kids stayed with Hamilton, a couple of the kids stayed with her, but he goes through this year. By November of 92, Reynolds has gotten himself in some hot water. He's been participating in a little bit of a scam where there are certain wages owed to Revolutionary War soldiers, and these soldiers aren't confident they're getting their money back, so they've sold off the paper, right? So, they may be owed $20, but someone's willing to give them $10 for that $20 IOU, that kind of thing. And so he's in this scheme, and he is going to implicate Hamilton, that Hamilton has been paying him off, and that he's got part of this scheme. So Monroe, Venable, and Muhlenberg, not, by the way, Madison, Jefferson, and Burr, come to see him. So the three characters on the stage, none of those three were involved in this at all. Okay, so they had on the stage Jefferson, Madison, and Burr were the ones who came to talk to him. None of the three of them were involved in this at all. So Monroe, Venable, and Muhlenberg, now this is back in 1792, they confront Hamilton. And Hamilton has his cash books, and he's able to show them that he basically says, look, if I can prove to you that I made these payments, but they were of a personal nature, not about this scheme, will you keep it quiet? And they agree that they will. So he shows them the cash books. He shows them these letters that are going on between them because he saves his letters. And he proves that this was a love affair. It was a bad decision, but it wasn't about the treasury. It wasn't about his use of money. And so they, and walk away. So the timing of we know this is happening is not way, in time as it is in the play. It was all the way back when the affair happened in 92. What did happen in 97, now 5 years later, is that Hamilton is out as secretary. He's back in New York doing his thing as a lawyer. And he is, a thorn in people's side still. He's still in politics. He still can influence people. He still, when it comes to national elections, has a little bit of power. And Jefferson and he are not of the same mind, so they're back and forth with things. Back in 92, Monroe had sent the information to Jefferson, so they think. Right? This is all conjecture. That Jefferson has now this information. And in 97, he decides he's going to unleash it. So in 97, through Thomas Callender, he gets this thing to come out talking about this affair. So Hamilton knows that the only way this information got out is if Monroe gave it to someone. And Monroe had promised, right, pinky swear promise, he's not telling anybody. But somehow it gets out. Monroe was hated by Hamilton and his wife for a long, long time. Hamilton's wife, Elizabeth, lived way into, she actually went to when they started to build the Washington Monument, there was a congressman named Abraham Lincoln that was there with her, right? So she lived that long in time. Monroe went to see her. He begged her forgiveness. She said, no, not forgiving you. Had Hamilton survived the duel, there's a lot of speculation, when you do those counterfactuals, that in 1820, when Monroe ran for